Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining me tonight as we delve into the Seder in Bnei Brak. We're not quite at our own Seders yet, but tonight we're going to join five famous rabbis at their Seder in Bnei Brak. The text that we're going to be focusing on tonight is probably one of the most famous passages from the section of Magid in our Haggadot. And there's a number of questions that I want to think about tonight. But before we get there, I want to just share with you that this particular story is very near and dear to me because at my own family Seder for my entire childhood, this was the passage that I always got to read. This was my story. This was my passage because my name is Eliezer. So this story was always mine to begin with because it happens to be that the story begins Ma'aseh Rabbi Eliezer. So I always got to read this passage first. So I hope to be able to share with you some thoughts, some insights on this story tonight. So before we actually delve into the text itself, I'll give a little background to what our plan is for this evening. So the text that we're going to look at, which is the famous story of the five rabbis in Bnei Brak, is not found in any Mishnah or any Braita or any Gemara. It is solely found in the Haggadah, which is unique in and of itself, because much of the Haggadah, as you well know, are compilations, right? There's a part of a Mishnah, there's a part of a Braita, a Medrash, and they're all pulled together, and that becomes our Haggadah. But the opening narrative of the five rabbis, the opening part of the five rabbis eating in Bnei Brak only appears in the Haggadah. Now, this isn't to say that it's any less authentic, that it's nowhere else to be found, but what it does tell us is that it was preserved specifically here because it seems to be somewhat essential to the section of Magid. So that's what I want to think about tonight. Our major question is going to be, what is the purpose of this story in our section of Magid? What's the purpose of the Haggadah in and of itself, right? What's the major purpose of Seder night? It's to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? It's to recall the Pesach, to recall the matzah, to eat the matzah. But there's no mitzvah to talk about other people who had a Seder, right? That's not necessarily intuitive to what it means to have your own Seder, right? You talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, but to talk about somebody else having their own Seder is somewhat peculiar. So that's something that we need to be thinking about writ large, and that's going to be one of the major questions that we're going to try to address tonight. So at this point, we're going to dive into the story itself, and we're going to pick up on a number of other kind of minor questions that are going to help us address this major question as to what it's doing in the Haggadah. And to do that, we obviously have to look at the text itself. I sent out, and it was sent out on the WhatsApp as well, the source sheets, but I'll share them again right now in the chat. And feel free to download those. You can print them out as well. And also, if you have questions, comments, feel free to put them in the chat. And let me just, and it will be available for you to download. Alrighty, so I'm going to pull up the source sheet now. Alrighty. Okay. So here it goes. The opening part of the story, and by the way, there's two sections here. Note that I have the top section is the story that we're familiar with. The bottom section we'll deal with a little bit later. That part actually does appear in a Mishnah in Brachot, but the top part is the main story. The bottom is kind of a separate story, yet connected, and that's what we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so Maaseh Rabbi Eliezer, there's a story of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon, five major rabbis who lived in the 1st and 2nd century. Shahayu Mesubin b'Bnei Brak, right? They're reclining, which obviously can sometimes mean just dining in general, but here is referencing obviously Haseba at the Seder. They're reclining in Bnei Brak, in the city of Bnei Brak. V'hayu mesaprim b'Yetziat Mitzrayim kol oto halayla, right? They spent all night discussing the exodus from Egypt. Ad sheba'u talmideim, until their students came, ve'amru lahem, and they said to their teachers, Rabotenu, our masters, our rabbis, Higia zman kriyat shema shel shachri. The time has come to recite Kriyat Shema in the morning. I'm going to stop my share screen, but I'll jump back and forth between it throughout the evening. When we look at the story, the first thing that we should note is that it opens up with ma'aseh, meaning it opens up with the word story. I'm going to tell you a story. So whenever you see that in a Gemara, in a Braita, in a Mishnah, what that means is it's going to either prove or disprove something that was previously said. We're going to have to talk about what that is it's doing, but ma'aseh is almost always connected to that which came before it. So we'll have to look at that in just a moment. But essentially, one of the questions I want to ask is, it's talking about a story. So generally, when you hear a story, you want to know a few things about it. One of the questions you want to ask yourselves is, well, when did the story happen? Right? That's a major question that we all like to ask about any story we hear, about any narrative we hear. And so it's clear that this story must have happened after the destruction of the temple. How do we know that? How do we know the story took place after the destruction of the second temple? Feel free to put it in the chat. What's the clue? Oh, so Penina says maybe it's Shachrit, maybe because Shachrit is really Keneged, the Tamid Shel Boker. Larry, there's no Korban. What are they? They're in Bnei Brak. Where should they be if they are living during the time of the actual temple? They should be in Yerushalayim. Now, there are those who are pater, who don't have to go if you're very elderly, you can't make it, you're sick, you're a tump. There's all these reasons why. But generally speaking, this seems to be the case. We're after 70 CE. Okay. So then we're going to have to figure out, well, where are we? And what I'd like to suggest at this point, and we're going to see why later on, I'd like to suggest that when this story took place is actually very important to understanding its place in the Haggadah itself. Okay, and we'll get back to that. Another question that one should ask when looking at this story is, why these 5 rabbis? There are many great Tanaim, many great rabbis living in the 1st and 2nd centuries. These happen to be probably 5 of the greatest, but specific to talk Brak, right? There's many other places that the Seder could have taken place. What's another location? Anybody know? What would another major city during this time period have been for Jews to have had an important Seder? What location are we missing here? Larry says Yavne, exactly. The major center of Jewish life post Beit Sheni is Yavne. Famously, the story goes, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is carried out in a coffin, and he essentially sets up a yeshiva in Yavne, and that becomes the major, fundamental yeshiva and the house of the political center of Judaism post Second Temple. So why aren't they having their Seder in Yavne? Right? It seems to be the second greatest place that one could choose. Next, I have a question. Feel free to put it in the chat. When does your Seder end? When's your Seder end? What time? Tehillah, 12 to 1, right? That's 12:30. Yeah, it's about right. You always have some of the later, the people who like to stay up a little later, but essentially, what's the problem with their Seder? All night long. We end our Seder at midnight because Chatzot, midnight, is when we have to eat the Afikomen. And okay, there's a few extra things you can do, but essentially, Magid is done. Much of the Seder is already over. So why is it that their Seder goes so late, so long, that we obviously come to the next piece, which is that the Talmidim, the students, have to essentially tell them it's time to say Kriyat Shema in the morning. The final kind of piece to this puzzle, and then we'll dive into some text itself and some sources, is the last part. After the story is told, we have one last piece related to the story itself. And that's what I'd like to show you right now, which is the second piece in the story. So after the story is told in the Haggadah, what do? Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah speaks, and he says the following. And I remember how I noted that this piece is actually a Mishnah in Brachos. Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Harei ani kiven shivim shana. I am like a man of 70 years old. V'lo zachiti shete'amar yitziat Mitzrayim ba'leilot ad shedirasha ben zoma. I didn't merit to, mention or speak about the exodus from Egypt at night until I heard the interpretation of Ben Zoma. Shene'amar, as the pasuk says, and this pasuk references Passover night. Leman tizkor et yom tzeitcha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yamei chayecha, that you should recall the exodus from Egypt all the days of your life. Yamei chayecha hayamim, the days. Kol yamei chayecha, all comes to include halelot. The rabbis, the chachamim, disagree. V'chachamim omrim yamei chayecha haolam hazeh. You have to remember the exodus in this world. Kol yamei chayecha comes to include lehavi liyimot hamashiach. During the Messianic age, you will also have to remember this particular mitzvah of remembering Yitziat Mitzrayim. It's not so clear that he's talking, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah ben Zoma, that they're actually talking about the Seder night. Well, the pasuk they're talking about is about the Seder night. The Gemara seems to assume they're actually talking about whether or not you have to remember it in the Shema at night. Right? There's a machloket whether the third paragraph of Shema, which is about tzitzis, Yitzias Mitzrayim, that's really seemingly what Chazal understand this machloket to be about. Nevertheless, it's put right into our Haggadah. And it's put right after the story. So essentially, who's the only person in the story who gets a speaking part? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. He gets to speak. And the question we're going to have to discover, and the answer that we'll have to figure out, is whether this is actually related to the story above it, or it happens to be that the Haggadah is just using this as a pretext to mention a teaching of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, but not related to the previous story. I've laid out a lot of questions, but all of these questions are to figure out what this is doing in the Haggadah. At this point, if you have any questions yourself that you want to throw into the chat about this story, feel free to do so, and hopefully throughout the night we'll be able to address some of these as well. Okay, and also feel free to use the raise your hand or the other. I love Malka's question. Where were their families? Unfortunately, I will not be able to answer that question tonight. That is. There's only so much you can do with the text you have in front of you. But their families seem to be missing. Now, we could perhaps imagine that their families are there, they're just not mentioned. But that's a very valid point. But who is there? They're students. And we'll have to figure out perhaps what the purpose of having their students there during this time is. Okay, so here we go. Let's begin to unpack these questions. The context of the story. Ma'aseh. There's a story here. The story has to be understood within the context of the Haggadah. What comes immediately before this story in the Haggadah? What is the last things we said? Does anybody recall? I know we're not quite at Passover yet. If I asked you the day after Pesach, everyone would know exactly what comes right before this story. It's a little bit of a test. What comes right before this story? I know probably some of you have a Haggadah in front of you, which is certainly helpful. I see a couple people smiling. So what right before this section, we say, right, this is the beginning of Magid, right? We say, Avadim hayinu lafar b'Mitzrayim, we were slaves in Egypt. And then we eventually get to the point, we say, Afilu Rosh Chodesh, exactly. And then we get to, Afilu kulanu chachamim, even had we all been chachamim, unavonim, kulanu zakenim, had we been the most wise in our nation, we know that if we had known the whole Torah, nevertheless, we have a mitzvah, l'saper b'yitzias Mitzrayim. The kol hamarbeh, whoever kind of keeps going, whoever adds as much to the story that they can, hareze mishubach. Such a person is praised. It's praiseworthy to continue to add. So once we've said that in the Haggadah, Maaseh, here is a text. Why? 5 greatest rabbis of their generation. I'm telling you, they knew the story of the Exodus, and nevertheless, they spent all night talking about it. So it's, on the one hand, supposed to get us kind of pumped for the evening. Get ready for the Haggadah. These greatest rabbis knew how to do it. So can you. So on the one hand, it's kind of like getting you excited for Seder night. But on the other hand, there's a lot more to it as well. There's an interesting perspective that we'll see in just a few moments that the Rav I'll just share it with you now, actually, that the Rav Soloveitchik suggests that one of the other messages of this particular story, and this is like a good nugget, is that if you look at the rabbis in the story, so they're all different ages, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Some are older, some are younger, some are kind of in between. And essentially the Rav says this is supposed to influence us and to make us understand that the whole purpose of the Haggadah is to be intergenerational. It's supposed to go from the oldest statesman, one of whom is Rabbi Eliezer in the story, to even the youngest person at the Seder, who we'll see is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. It's all about the Masorah and passing down the tradition from generation to generation. So the major question, what it's doing in Haggadah, we'll have to continue to mine as we go on. But I want us to help us along the way by figuring out when this Seder took place. Okay. Can you put in the chat for me when this Seder took place? When did the Seder take place? I know there are people in this Zoom call who every year at their Seder must tell me and must say at their Seder when they think this took place. Ira, thank you. Bar Kochba, thank you, Ira. There's got to be a couple other people at this Seder who's heard that. We say that at my Seder every year. You don't have to be embarrassed. This is not at my Seder every year we say that as well. And there's what to be said about that particular approach. It was put forth by a number of scholars in the early 20th century. There's a whole host. Professor Finkelstein is one of them, and many others who have put forth that particular theory. And how the theory goes is the following. Just kind of al regel achas, the theory goes as follows. Bar Kochba revolt takes place in 132 to 135, about 60 plus years after the Chorban Habayit. Right, they're getting ready. It's almost been 70 years. They believe the third temple is going to be rebuilt. So what do? The rabbis gather together on the Seder night, led essentially by Rabbi Akiva, who we know was the major religious figure in the Bar Kochba revolt. And while they're having their Pesach Seder, they're also essentially planning the rebellion. Right? That's how the theory goes. And therefore, why didn't they know what time it was? They were in a cave. They were in a room. They were the major leaders of the generation. They didn't know what time it was outside because they had no idea if the sun came up or not. Their students were essentially guarding the doors. And so when they came in and told them that it was time for Shachrit, maybe it wasn't only about Kriyat Shema, but maybe there was a little bit of a little bit of a innuendo here about it's time to battle, it's time to fight, it's time to go and do the work of the revolt of Bar Kochba. That's one approach. And while that approach was one that I grew up with, and I'm sure many others grew up with, I personally, this evening, will try to deconstruct that particular theory for a couple of reasons. One, newer scholarship tends to point to the possibility that probably 3 out of 5 of the rabbis at this Seder were no longer living by the time of the Bar Kochba revolt. Right, so the oldest person there was Rabbi Eliezer. He was also a rabbi during the time of the Second Temple and is most likely no longer alive anymore. He's not mentioned during the Bar Kochba revolt, etc. There's what to be said about that. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he was the youngest person at that Seder. He was, say Chazal, he died young. The Gaonim talk about this. He died young, so he likely was also not alive by that point because he's not mentioned in any of the stories during that time period. And the same is probably true about Rabbi Yehoshua. So it's possible that it is, but it's more likely that it's not. So tonight I want to explore perhaps what it is and how that will help us understand what it's all about. I want to add that it's also somewhat unusual to claim that one of the fundamental stories about the Haggadah is really just a guise for rebellion, right? This is like the fundamental text in our Maggid section. I'm not quite sure that would be the reason to incorporate it into our Seder year after year after year, right? I think it really is trying to tell us moral lessons, more so than perhaps militaristic ones, right? Although it's an interesting perspective, I'm not sure it's exactly the proper one. Yeah, I see people talking about the Harugei Malchus. The Asar Harugei Malchus takes place over like a 2-century period, so they weren't all during one time period. Rabbi Akiva is one of them who dies. It was killed al Kiddush Hashem like 135. There are others, but some are from Beit Sheni, some are post. So that doesn't help us necessarily understand the story itself. Okay. To understand truly when this Seder took place and why that's important, we have to understand who was missing from this particular Seder. I've already told you that the 5 greatest rabbis of the generation were at the Seder. I saw somebody put it in the chat. Who are we missing? Now, if you read Mishnayos or Gemaras, so sometimes it's hard to know who lived during what time period. But there is one major rabbi, one major rabbinic figure who is missing from this Seder. Larry points out Rabban Gamliel. So Rabban Gamliel was the Nasi, right? So imagine you're telling a story about something that happens, in 2021, and you're talking about, all the major politicians, but one's missing. So that's obvious that he's missing. So it's glaringly obvious that one of the major figures is missing from the Seder, and that's going to be very important. Rabban Gamliel. He's also known, if you Google his name, if you look him up, there were a number of Rabban Gamliels. This is Rabban Gamliel II of Yavne. He was the Nasi. He essentially was one of the major religious and political figures during the period after the Second Temple was destroyed. He's 5th generation Hillel, right? His great-great-great-grandfather was Hillel, the famous Hillel. And he's also, one of his descendants becomes Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, right? Who authors and compiles the Mishnah. He is missing. And the fact that he's missing becomes even more interesting when we find out that there's one other major Passover Seder recorded in our tradition. And whose Seder is it specifically? Rabban Gamliel. So you have 2 major Seders in our perspective, in our history. And one of them has Rabban Gamliel and one has everyone else. So like Elie pointed out in the chat, there seems to be a division that seems to be lining up here. We seem to have 2 different camps, and that's going to be important to understanding what's going on in this Seder. So what better way to understand than by looking at Rabban Gamliel's Seder? So let's dive in. It's very short. It's like 4 lines. The Tosefta. It's a Tosefta, meaning it's a Breita, essentially in Masechet Pesachim, that tells a story. Ma'aseh beRabban Gamliel. We have a story of Rabban Gamliel, just like we had a story of the 5 rabbis. Uzikenim. He also has elders with him. We don't know their names. Shehayu mesubin bebeit Baitus ben Zonin. They again were reclining where? In the house of Baitus ben Zonin. So Baitus ben Zonin was one of the major land-owning families in the land of Israel after Beit Sheni, very wealthy. So remember, Rabban Gamliel, he's the Nasi. So he's eating with the big donors, essentially, with the major wealthy individuals in the land of Israel. Where? In Lod. So going back to what Larry said, here we also notice Jerusalem is done, right? The temple's destroyed. We aren't living there anymore. Lod. Right? We know Lod as Ben Gurion Airport today. V'hayu asukin behilchot haPesach. What were they doing in their Seder? They were delving into the laws of Passover. Kol halayla ad krot hagever, all night long until the crowing of the rooster, which essentially means daybreak in the morning. Higbiu milifnehem, so their servants come and lift up their trays. Remember, people used to eat on little trays. V'no adu, they kind of shake themselves off. V'halchu lahen lebeit hamidrash. They go to the Beis Medrash to learn, maybe to daven, right? This is the first day of Passover. That is the story of Rabban Gamliel. What do you notice are some similarities, but also strikingly some differences? Feel free to put them in the chat. What are some differences or similarities that you see between these 2 stories? It also went all night. Thank you, Pnina. It also went all night. We don't go all night. So both stories go all night. What else do we have? The students don't tell them it's time. Thank you, Scott. So we have, it just kind of tells us that, the morning came and the tables were lifted up, meaning like it sounds as if in the story of Rabban Gamliel, nobody had to tell them it was time. They knew it was time. They snapped their fingers, the servants came over, and they went to the Beit Midrash. When you hear Beit Midrash, No students. Thank you. There are no students there. That's also a major difference. They're not telling the Haggadah. What are they doing instead? They're not Misaper Yetzias Mitzrayim. What are they doing? They're talking about halachot. In our Seder, the 5 rabbis, they're talking about the story. And in Rabban Gamliel's Seder, they're talking about the halachot. You can imagine, it's like one Seder is for Hasidim, and one Seder was for Litvaks, like, Kiviyachol. So it's very different. One's halachic based, and one was more kind of agadot, one was story, one was recounting. Very different models of the Seder. And remember, at the end of the Seder, the first group goes, it's time to say Shema, which sounds like davening, it's a mitzvah. The others are going to the Beis Medrash. Also, it's learning. It's very heavily focused on halacha, learning. That's very different, a very different model than the first story. I'd like to just kind of understand these 2 Seders as 2 different models of Judaism at that time. And I think you could still see that throughout today. One was very intergenerational. One was very much focused on the story and reliving the experience. That's the first model. They kind of went overboard. They kept going all the night. They needed their students to ground them. They were so overtaken by the experience that they needed kind of somebody to remind them in the morning, hey, it's time to say Shema. In the Rabban Gamliel model, it's very ordered. We're going to talk about the halachot of what used to happen at the Beit HaMikdash. And this is the same Rabban Gamliel who we know at the end of the Maggid section who says what? Rabban Gamliel haya omer kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach lo yatsa yedei chavato b'Pesach. Pesach matzah. You have to say these 3 things or you are not exempt from the Seder night. I want you to read that as a literal kick to the first story. Rabban Gamliel is saying that Seder that you just read about at the beginning, not good. They didn't talk about Pesach Matzah Maror. They talked about the Exodus. They didn't talk about the intricate laws of how you have the Passover Paschal lamb in the times of the temple. Very different models. And I think what we're going to see as we continue this evening is the first model essentially becomes the model that we use for our Seder. We don't forget about Rabban Gamliel, right? We incorporate him, but he's at the end. We put him towards the end of our Maggid section because we defer kavod to the approach of Rabban Gamliel, and we'll see how we do that in a couple other locations, essentially. But our model is one of retelling, recounting, re-experiencing. And so the Maaseh Rabbi Eliezer, etc., that whole story is trying to teach us what it means to have our very own Seders. Our model is a model of re-experiencing, so much so perhaps that they even went a little too far. We'll talk about that. But that essentially is the story and one of the messages of the Maaseh Rabbi Eliezer story. Before we move on, any questions or comments that you want to feel free to throw in the chat. Okay. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Milan. For anybody who's been there, you'll know that the Da Vinci's Last Supper is in Milan. And prior to flying there, I was getting excited, but also very nervous because I wanted to see the Da Vinci's Last Supper, but my assumption was that it was in a church and I wouldn't be able to go. But turns out, for those of you who have been, it's actually in a mess hall. It's in a dining room of what was essentially a campus grounds for clergy. And so it's really in an auditorium, not in a church itself. So I was able to go. You get 10 minutes in front of the Last Supper. It's incredible for those of you who have been or have not yet been. And you really feel like you're there. It's massive. It's not a fresco. There's different exactly what it is, but it's really amazing. And when looking at that image, who sits smack in the center? The most important person at the Seder. Yeshu sits smack in the center of that table. When you say, the person sitting at the head of the table, that's what they meant essentially in that particular image, smack in the center. So our Gemara, our tradition has the same notion. The person who sits smack in the middle of a Haggadah, of a meal, is the most important person at that meal. So trying to understand more about the history of our story, it's important to know the order of where people sat, because the Gemara teaches us not only is it important to know who sits in the center, but there's an order, a pecking order of who sits where at the table. And that's actually going to be exceptionally informative to us. In order to kind of trickle down that information without delving too much into the Gemara, and we're going to look at Rabbi Sachs Zitzal's interpretation, where he has a small section on this, and I'll pull it up. It's in your source sheet on page number 2, where he explains this in his essays on the Haggadah. Look at what he notes. And this is based upon the Gemara. It says the order of the names tells us the seating arrangement that night. It reveals the surprising fact that it was neither the eldest nor the most learned of those present. The senior guest that night, who was it sitting in the center? Was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And how do you get there? Let me just explain. Hebrew is right to left, right? When you read Hebrew right to left, how does that work? So if you were to chart who's sitting at the table, you have to go Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he's the third name, followed by Rabbi Akiva, followed by Rabbi Tarfon, right? You just write them out on a line, all 5 names, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So who's sitting in the center? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And notes Rabbi Sachs, the next senior who's sitting directly above him, meaning to his right, is Rabbi Yehoshua. We'll get back to that. Below him was Rabbi Akiva, meaning to his left was Rabbi Akiva. And then he notes, now we can date this episode precisely. It belongs to the period, a brief one, when Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the Nasi, the religious head of the Jewish community. Let's stop for a moment and explain what's going on here. Some of you may be familiar. There's a famous Gemara in Brachot, famous because it's exceptionally long. I wish we had the time to go through it tonight, but it's very long. It's a number of dapim, but it's extraordinary. Kind of basics of the story. Rabban Gamliel's the Nasi, meaning he's the Rosh Yeshiva, he's the head political figure, the head religious figure. It's his way or no way, right? You have to follow Rabban Gamliel. And so essentially Rabbi Yehoshua, who's at our Seder, was his number 2, was his vice president. And Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabban Gamliel butt heads day and night. Many stories. Famously, you may recall the story where he forces Rabbi Yehoshua to show up on the day that Rabbi Yehoshua thought it was Yom Kippur, with a staff in his hand and money, and essentially prove that it was not Yom Kippur, to show that Rabban Gamliel's calculations of the calendar were superior to that of Rabbi Yehoshua. That's one example. So the Gemara in Brachos teaches us that they got into another one of these fights, which the Gemara tells us actually was instigated by a student who they name at the end of the story was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It's an interesting piece to the story that we can talk about another time. And so essentially what happens is Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua butt heads, and he punishes Rabbi Yehoshua. He makes him stand, right? If you're in a classroom, and I don't think this can happen today in a 21st century classroom. I don't have any children in classrooms, nor do I teach in a classroom, but I imagine this is not punishment that's done today. In a classroom, you can't tell a student to stay standing, indefinitely as a way to punish them. That's what Rabban Gamliel did. He said, Rabbi Yehoshua, you stand indefinitely. And so what happened? All the students and the rabbis got upset with Rabban Gamliel, and they kicked him out. They kicked out the head, the Rosh Yeshiva. And they had to now figure out who's going to be the next leader of the Jewish people. Who's going to be the next Nasi? They chose, after deliberating, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who's in our story, and who Rabbi Sachs notes is smack in the center of the table. Now, why is it shocking that he's smack in the center of our table? Because he was the youngest person at that Seder. The youngest person, and we know that he became the Nasi when he was just 18 years old. The Yerushalmi thinks he was 16, obviously a great sage. And famous story about him is that the day that he was about to become the Nasi, he went to his wife and he said, they want to make me the Nasi. And one of the things she said to him was, well, look, you're a little too young for the position. So a miracle took place and 70 rows of gray hair kind of erupted on his hair. And so now he looks older. That's the famous story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and he became the Nasi. So notes Rabbi Sachs and others point this out as well. If Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is sitting smack in the center, what does that mean? He is the Nasi at this very moment. You would never place the youngest person in the center of the table. It would be embarrassing to everyone else at the table unless he's the Nasi. We know it was a short period of time because the story continues. Eventually, they let Rabban Gamliel have it back, but they did like a special trade-off. Rabban Gamliel was the Nasi 3 weeks of the month, and essentially Rabbi Elazar was once a month. But essentially, by having him at the center of the table, it tells us that it's during a very specific moment in time when he was the Nasi. So where's Rabban Gamliel? He's not sitting with those people. He's not sitting at the all of those rabbis, almost all those rabbis are in the Gemara and Brachos kicking him out. There's no way he's sitting at that table. And so when the Gemara teaches us that there's essentially another Seder with Rabban Gamliel, it's because he was not going to eat with them. So we'll pick up on that in just a few moments. But before we do so, I want to point out to you a few other interesting things about the order of the rabbis sitting at the tables. And to do that, I've made these little charts, which I think will be helpful to understanding the order. So here just is the basic order, right? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is in the center. So he reads Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon. That's the order. Look at this chart right here. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is the Nasi. Who is the vice president? He was the vice president under Rabban Gamliel, and he remains the vice president under Rabbi Elazar, is Rabbi Yehoshua, right here. Who's the next most important person? Is the person to the left of center, Rabbi Akiva. Why is Rabbi Akiva left of center? And this answers another question we had. Rabbi Akiva was the only person who lived in Bnei Brak. This is the home of Rabbi Akiva. His base din, his yeshiva was in Bnei Brak. We actually know where all of these other individuals lived. Some were in Yavne, some lived in Lod. Rabbi Yeshua was from up north. This is the home of Rabbi Akiva. So he has the third most important seat at the table. Who gets kind of the two outer areas? Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Tarfon, right? They're older rabbinic figures, but they kind of get off to the side. They're not the most important people at this Seder. While researching for this year, I came across another interesting order of this particular Seder. This particular interpretation I have not seen anywhere. If I see it somewhere, then it's not my chiddush, but if we don't see it anywhere, then I'll claim it for me for now, which is the next interpretation of the order. Look at the second interpretation of this order. Actually, before I do that, let me just explain to you what I'm about to show you. The major factions in Judaism in the 1st and 2nd centuries, what were they? During the time of the temple, it was the Pharisees versus the Sadducees, right? The Pharisees believe in the oral law. We're descendants of the Pharisees, rabbinic Judaism. The Sadducees don't. The Sadducees were focused in Yerushalayim, were mostly Kohanim. After Beit Sheni, there are still Sadducees, but it's less critical in the focus of Judaism. There's also obviously Christianity. It's emerging. It's Judeo-Christians early on. But when you look specifically at rabbinic Judaism, what are the two major factions within our people? Tehillah gets it exactly. Hillel and Shammai. Now, if you leave with the Hillel and Shammai that we know from school, so then what do you mean there were different factions? Well, one paskin one way, one thought the menorah should be one way, one thought it should be the other way. One held Kiddush should be that way, one held Kiddush should be the other way. It's missing the point. Hillel and Shammai were, religious figures, but it was their houses, their students who over generations developed such differences that the Gemara teaches us that at a certain point, they wouldn't even marry each other. If you don't marry somebody from the other family, what does that essentially mean? That's the end. Right? If your kids can't marry their kids, then you're essentially writing them off from Jewish history. So there's more of that. There was infighting. There was a lot of issues between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. So it's not only the fact that they were, different religious approaches. They wouldn't even marry each other. So what I'd like to note is that famously Yavne, which is the center of Judaism following the Beit HaMikdash, famously it's there that Beit Hillel triumphs over Beit Shammai. Right? That's where there's going to be most of the rulings where we paskin like Beit Hillel, not like Beit Shammai. There's a lot to be said about this, but what I want to show you is that this Seder highlights the triumph of Beis Hillel over Beis Shammai. Look at this image for you right here. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is firmly encamped in the Hillel. We know this from multiple places, as is Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Akiva. Beis Hillel. Rabbi Eliezer, who's the oldest person there, famously sometimes referred to as a Shammai, meaning like a person of the house of Shammai. And Rabbi Eliezer famously said he'll only teach that which his teachers taught him, because Shammai was very much a tradition of receiving, not of chiddush, not of renewing, not of figuring out your own interpretation. That was Beis Hillel. Rabbi Tarfon is more interesting. Rabbi Tarfon is from the house of Shammai. Famously, the Gemara tells us, it's one of the earliest Mishnayos and Brachos, that when he wanted to say Kriyat Shema at night, what did he do? He lied down, because Beis Shammai holds b'shoch becha. You have to lie down, and he endangered himself because there were robbers nearby. Eventually, Rabbi Tarfon jumps ship and becomes Beis Hillel. But who sits at the outside of this Seder? Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel is firmly in the center. So I'd like to suggest that also this Seder is actually trying to affirm the supremacy of Beis Hillel over Beis Shammai, which I think is a really interesting interpretation of this particular moment in time, because that was the moment of division within the Jewish people. But there's a bright side. It's not just about one ruling over the other. Who sits at the table? Beit Shammai. They're there. They're at the Seder. Just like we say the Rosh is still at the Seder, Beit Shammai was still at the Seder with Beis Hillel. I want to show you one other. The story about them marrying each other happens at a particular time period. I don't know exactly when that happened. Eventually it does get resolved though. It does get resolved. It had to do with a lot of particular questions about different lineages, but it does get resolved. But that's a good point. There's one other interpretation as to the order, which I think is fascinating, and I want to show it to you. This one is from the Chida. The Chida, Rav Azulai, who lives in the dies in the early 19th century, has a really interesting interpretation as well. He says something interesting. Look at what I've brought for you here. Rabbi Eliezer was a Kohen, we know it. Rabbi Yoshua was a Levi, we also know that, right? Because there are Gemaras about Trumas, Maestros, we know that. Rabbi Elazar ben Azari was also a Kohen. Rabbi Akiva was descendants of converts, which makes him essentially a Yisrael, not a Kohen, not a Levi. Rabbi Tarfon was also a Kohen. 3 out of 5 were Kohanim. 1 was a Levi, 1 was a Yisrael / from descendants of converts. Notes the Chida, this story of the 5 rabbis comes just a few lines after Avadim Hayinu Lefar b'Mitzrayim. Now tell me, which one of those 5 was a slave in Egypt? Which one of them had an ancestor who was a slave in Egypt? None of them. The Leviim, which includes obviously the Kohanim, were not slaves in Egypt. They were the spiritual ruling class, and eventually that kind of spills over into the Torah as well. And Rabbi Akiva is a descendant of converts. None of them were biologically descendants, but nevertheless, says the Chida, they say Avadim Hayinu Lafar b'Mitzrayim, because it's not about the biological connection, it's about the spiritual destiny of our people. And it's a very beautiful interpretation. It's very similar to what Maimonides says, that he paskins that a convert can say, Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, because even though biologically they weren't your parents, they weren't your ancestors, you are part of the destiny of the Jewish people. And I also think it's beautiful that the Kohanim are kind of like on the ends in the center. It's kind of a beautiful image of kind of being embraced by the Kohanim. So it's a really interesting way in which we see it play out. And I love that interpretation of the Chida. Okay, enough about the order. I hope that wasn't too technical, but I think it's really, really, really fascinating, the order. And we could probably go on about the order, but we'll hold it off for now. Why did they talk all night long? What are they doing all night long? Misaprim b'tzias mitzrayim kol halayla. You end the Seder with the Afikomen. So I think Elie noted already in the chat that there was a machloket. Right? Like many things, there was a machloket. Essentially, the machloket was the following. Either you finish it at midnight, which is what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah held, as did Rabban Gamliel. Remember, he has his own Seder, which also, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, holds that it ends at night. But Rabbi Akiva holds that it goes until the morning. So let me say that one more time. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds that it ends at midnight. Rabbi Akiva held it goes to the morning. Who else holds it goes to the morning? Rabban Gamliel. So when we look at our two Seders, both go to the morning. So Rabban Gamliel, it makes sense. It's his Seder, goes to the morning. Whose Seder are we at in our story? Who's at the head of the table? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. If he's at the head of the table, how should we paskin? How do we paskin? If you're at somebody's Seder, it's my Seder. I'm the head of the table. It's my Seder. I should say the Seder ends at midnight. Yet their Seder went all night long. Why? We should be able to figure this out with some clues we gave earlier. Why do they go all night long? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds it goes only until midnight. Well, Ira, whose house is it? That's the question. The host, thank you. The host was Rabbi Akiva. And what the Tanaim teach us, what the Mishnah teaches us, is the machloket was actually between Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah on the one hand and Rabbi Akiva on the other. So here we have a machloket, and the machloket says midnight or essentially all morning, meaning go till let's say 6 a.m. Rabbi Akiva held you go all night long. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says only until midnight, and yet their Seder went all night long. So I think it's actually quite beautiful because Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the new Nasi, defers to the host, meaning to the real host, to the person whose house it actually is. While Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who is the Nasi and the most important person at that table, paskins else otherwise, and yet he defers to Rabbi Akiva. But actually, the machloket goes a little bit deeper than the surface, midnight till 6 a.m. Because why do they argue on the timing? Why do they argue on the timing? Midnight, 6 a.m. Why do they argue chatzos or the morning? I think what's going on here, we have to just a basic background on the machloket here. The Torah tells us that you have to eat your Pesach at the time of chipazon. Chipazon was haste, right? The Torah tells us the Jews were in haste. They ran out of Egypt. Chipazon. So you have to eat your Pesach b'chipazon. So it's machloket. What time did chipazon take place? I don't know the time that it happened. Was it midnight during Makat Bechorot, at the moment that the Egyptians were at their most vulnerable time? Did the Egyptians say to the Jews, get out of my country? Therefore, that's the time of chipazon. It's when the Egyptians put pressure on the Jews, and that's the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Or was it when they physically left Egypt, which is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva? I'll just say that one more time. Rabbi Akiva holds it's when the Jews physically left Egypt, which was 6 a.m., give or take. And what does Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah say? No, it's midnight when the Egyptians were so fed up with us that they couldn't care what we did at this point. Just get out of my country. So that's the machloket. And that machloket obviously has different times. One's midnight, one's essentially 6 a.m. There's a deeper meaning, I believe, to that machloket, which is to say, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah represents the establishment. He's the Nasi. Yes, he's young, but he's the Nasi. He's a political force. We have stories of him visiting Rome. We have stories of him talking to people of power. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah represents the establishment, and for him, you can celebrate redemption, you can celebrate the Paschal Lamb, you can celebrate the Seder, even at midnight, and when it's the darkest moment, you don't have to wait until morning comes. Meaning to say, and this is not my interpretation, many have noted this, that for Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and for others who held that really only until midnight, it's about the fact that while we're still under Roman occupation, we can still have religious freedom. They were physically still in Egypt, and yet we were free, meaning we had the spiritual audacity to have our Seder. So says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, that's enough for me. We're free to worship. Yeah, we're stuck in Egypt. Yeah, we're stuck under Roman oppression. It's good enough for me. That's chatzos for Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. But says Rabbi Akiva, and this is obviously the Rabbi Akiva of the revolt that will happen years later, no, not enough for me. How do you celebrate redemption? You can't celebrate redemption while you're still stuck in Egypt. Redemption is celebrated when morning comes, when we're no longer in Egypt, when we're no longer under oppression. And so I think hidden within the machloket about what happened in Egypt is really also a machloket about what's happening in their time period. Do we continue to remain loyal citizens under Rome? Or do we say, no, that's not good enough for us? We need not only spiritual freedom, but we need physical freedom as well. And that comes when morning rise for Rabbi Akiva. So there's a machloket halachic terms, but I think the machloket goes much deeper than that and actually reflects more of a political attention and political theory as well that differed between Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva. And that I think you see here as well. Okay. So before we continue, does anybody have any questions up until this point? We have a few more minutes. Okay. So I want to show you a particular, very briefly, a short interpretation of the Aruch HaShulchan, the author of the Aruch HaShulchan. Right? The Aruch HaShulchan is a major halachic work that was written a little over a century ago by Rabbi Yechiel Mechel Epstein. And in source number 4, he wrote a parush on the Haggadah known as Leil Shimurim. And within that interpretation, he suggests that the story that we keep talking about, right? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is the Nasi. He's the head of Yavne at this point. Rabbi Gamliel is maybe on the outs. But he wants to know, when exactly did this Seder take place? Like, get me a little bit closer to a particular time period. So I want to show you what he says, what Rabbi Yechiel Mechel Epstein says. And we'll just look at part of it. We're just going to pick up right here on the third line where my mouse is. He says, why doesn't this Seder take place in Yavne? Yavne was the home of Rabbi Elazar, but he's the new Rosh Hashiva. He's the new man in town. What are they doing in Bnei Brak? Remember, it's the house of Rabbi Akiva, but Rabbi Akiva wasn't the oldest person. It's not like they were going to the house of the oldest person, to like the grandfather in the family. Rabbi Eliezer was the oldest person. He doesn't live in Bnei Brak. Why are they all going to Rabbi Akiva's home? So says Rabbi Yechiel Mechel Epstein, he believes that this Seder took place, according to him, right after the destruction of the Second Temple. I'm going to suggest it happens a little later, but he says, Lachein, ba'u kulam li'iro, to the city of Rabbi Akiva, ulebeito shel Rabbi Akiva, to his house, except for Rabbi Gamliel, because he doesn't go because he thinks that at this point he may have already been back to Nisias. Veheim, because he had to go and sit with the elders, like the wealthy people. Veheim kulam ba'u elav l'saper b'yitzias Mitzrayim b'leil Chag HaPesach. Why do they go to Rabbi Akiva's home? Because only Rabbi Akiva can explain to them the eternal nature of the Jewish people. Nitzchiyut Yisrael. What does Rabbi Akiva have that every other rabbi doesn't have? Optimism. What do we know about Rabbi Akiva? He famously laughs when they see the destroyed temple. By the way, who's in that story? This is why he says this. Who's in that story? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is there. Rabbi Gamliel is there, so he ditches them. He goes to his own Seder. Right? These are the same characters, the same people. There's like one or two missing, but essentially the same people. So says Rabbi Yechiel Mechel Epstein, this happens very shortly after the destruction of the temple. I'm going to suggest maybe it happened a little later, but they could still see the destroyed temple, and they could not imagine a Seder without the temple. So they went to dine with Rabbi Akiva because he was a rabbi of optimism. They all were despondent, yet he had the ability to teach them what it meant to look forward to a future. That was what Rabbi Akiva represented. So therefore, they dined that Seder with Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva was able to influence them in a very positive way, in a very positive outlook. Thinking about the times, the dates, right? Yechiel Epstein suggests maybe it was right after the destruction. I'm going to suggest that it's not after the destruction, but it's not quite Bar Kochba. I'm going to suggest a year, a little bit in the middle. Now, this is me going out on a limb here, but I think it essentially would be a proper location to perhaps pinpoint this Seder, which is approximately the years 115. Approximately. Why do I suggest that? If we believe that this Seder took place perhaps during a tumultuous time period, perhaps after destruction, right? They're all gathered together. There's a lot going on. So perhaps this takes place around the year 115 to 117, because while maybe not so well known today, if you lived in the 2nd century, you knew what happened during the years 115 to 117. Does anybody know what happened during those couple of years, 115 to 117? Anyone aware? It's not such a fair question because, right, the Second Temple gets destroyed, Bar Kochba revolt happens, so pretty much anything in between is kind of forgotten about 2,000 years later, with 2 major events taking place right around them. But smack in the middle was what was known as the Trajan Revolt. You can Google it. You can look it up a little bit. It was also known as the Kythios War, or in Latin, it's referred to, and listen to the Latin word here, tumultus Iudaicus, which means essentially the tumultuous Jews, the Jews who revolted. Because during the years 115 to 117, as recorded by many Jewish/Roman historians, there was a Jewish revolt in North Africa and in Egypt against Roman rule, where the Jews were fed up with being treated differently, and they revolted. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed, according to Roman historians, during this time period, and it spilled over into Judea. The city of Lod, which is where Rabbi Gamliel has his Seder, was slaughtered. There's even, not in our Gemara, but there are interpretations that think that Rabbi Gamliel himself may have been killed during this war. And essentially, it was a time period that Jews felt, obviously, again, like it's up, like we're done. This is the end of it for us. It's not going to happen. We're not going to be able to rebuild. So perhaps it happened during this time period because it fits in very nicely with the fact that you have older rabbis like Rabbi Eliezer still at the Seder, and you have younger ones as well. You have this in-between generation, because if I'm correct, I believe many of them were probably deceased by Bar Kochba. And this time period was one of great tumult for the Jewish people. And so for them to eat with Rabbi Akiva meant that they would have what to look forward to. Rabbi Akiva was the leader who could focus them on what was important and a future that would be much better for them down the line. In the last few minutes that we have together, I'll just go just a few more minutes. Why do the students have to tell the rabbis that it's time to say Kriyat Shema? Right, so this is one of those questions that's perhaps a couple of different answers could be suggested. One is to say, well, they got overtaken by they were so involved in the story that they couldn't remember what time it was. They couldn't see that the sun was right. They didn't realize because they were so engaged in the story. So that perhaps is one way to look at it. But metaphorically, recall that this took place in the town of Rabbi Akiva, right? So it says Talmideihem, their students came forward. So probably each had a couple of Talmidim with them. But I would like to suggest that since we're talking about the yeshiva of Bnei Brak, the Beit Din of Bnei Brak, this is Rabbi Akiva's home. Famously, Rabbi Akiva has many students, right? He has 24,000 students. Famously, they're going to be killed either later on because of not treating each other well, but essentially, and we mourn their loss going through till Lag BaOmer. So there's actually a very nice connection between the Seder at Rabbi Akiva's home and then what we mourn during Sfira. So you have that beautiful connection there. I think his students probably were the majority of the students that came forward. And I think in a metaphoric, perhaps, way, we can see as them also offering some sort of comfort towards the rabbis at that Seder, right? They had an outlook that the other rabbis were missing. They had an interpretation of what it meant to be a Jew living in exile and what it meant to eventually have a better future that the other rabbis didn't have. And I think that might be one way to understand what goes on here. While at Rabbi Gamliel Seder, they were very timely. They knew exactly when it was time to get out. They knew morning, time to leave. I like what Ira said. He was also a convert, so he did have a different. His family was of converts, and so his family did have different ways of looking at things. And famously, Rabbi Akiva only becomes learned by the age of 40. That's when he starts his journey. So he has a very different way of looking at things, and I think that obviously led to him being the figure that he did become. So the students coming and telling them is either because they were so enveloped by the story, but I think it also might lend a little bit to the situation that was taking place in Bnei Brak with Rabbi Akiva. There are many other ways to look at that story, but I just want to close the last few minutes just talking very briefly about one last piece of that story and the Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah statement here. You know, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, I mentioned after we have that Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Ani keven shivim shana, I was like 70 years old. I already told you he wasn't 70 years old. He was 18 when he became the Rosh Hashiva. I want to point out, look in your source sheet. There's a beautiful Rabbi Professor Reuven Margolios has a commentary on the Haggadah. And in that commentary, he suggests the following. He says over here on the top, where it says Bo Bayom. Bo Bayom is a reference to the day that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the Rosh Hashiva and Rabbi Gamliel was deposed. So says Professor Margolio, this must have taken place around the time that Rabbi Gamliel was deposed. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the leader. That's why he sits in the center, just like Rabbi Sachs suggested. And essentially what that means is that we have to understand this story in light of what took place during that time period. We have to understand that it's this story over the interpretation, over the personality of Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel represented a harsh approach. He punished people by making them stand up. Rabbi Gamliel also famously did not allow people into the Beit Midrash unless they were exceptionally knowledgeable. They had to be the greatest Talmid Chacham to get into the doors. The second Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the Nasi, the Gemara tells us, hundreds of students were able to become Torah scholars, were able to learn Torah. Very different interpretations, which is why there are students at the story with Maaseh Rabbi. There are students there because he opened the doors to the yeshiva. Rabbi Gamliel Seder, no students whatsoever. It's showing the vision of what it means to be a proper teacher of Israel. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's approach becomes the approach that we interpret and that we experience and that we essentially approve of. You know, the Rambam's Haggadah, the text of his Haggadah is slightly different than ours in many ways, but in this story, there's one particular difference that makes this whole story work out very nicely. I want to show you what essentially not only the Rambam says, but the some other Rishonim, the Talmidei, the Ritzbah, which is a Tosfos, note the following. The drasha that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said that Lo zachiti shetamar yitzias Mitzrayim, I wasn't able to say it until this very day, says the Rambam, and I'll just tell you what the Rambam says outside first, says the Rambam, in his Haggadah, it doesn't say, you know, if you look at our text, it says Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, like he just said it. In the Rambam's Haggadah, it says Amar Lahem, meaning Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said to them at that very Seder. So this Mishnah that we have in Brachos, according to the Rambam, happened Bo Bayom, essentially. And it happened that he said it at the Seder, that today I am like a man of 70 years old. I have been, I've become the Nasi of the Jewish people. And now things are going to change. And that's why he's finally able to quote something in the name of Ben Zoma, because he's now able to say, I can paskin the way I want to because Rabbi Gamliel is gone. And essentially, he's trying to show that now we can do what Ben Zoma claims, which is what? What does Ben Zoma says? You should recite Tzizkoret Yom Tzeitzcha Me'eretz Mitzrayim Kol Yemei Chayecha. Yemei Chayecha Hayamim Kol Yemei Chayecha Haleilot. What are you supposed to do at night? You're supposed to be Mesaper b'Yitzias Mitzrayim. So what do they do at Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Seder? They are Mesaper b'Yitzias Mitzrayim kol oto alayla, meaning they do what it says in the teaching of Ben Zoma. So on the one hand, it might have to do with the third paragraph in Shema, but the Ritzbah, if you look here, and this is our last source, notes that the teaching Shetei Amaroto Adrasha, that Yitzias Mitzrayim Shechayav Adam Mesaper B'Leile Psachim. It's about being Mesaper B'Yitzias Mitzrayim at the Haggadah. Before Ben Zoma came around, what did you do at your Seder? You did like Rabban Gamliel. What did you do at your Seder? You talked halacha. Halacha is elitist. Only people who know are in the know. It's inside baseball. If you don't know it, you don't have anything to say. Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim is a democratization of the Seder, of the experience. Not only is it for everyone who wasn't even physically there, but it's even for the children, for the youngest among them. Perhaps Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah being the youngest person there is also an interesting interpretation that we should note. It's about everyone at the Seder. I want to kind of wrap up. We're on a few minutes over, so I want to wrap up now, and then obviously I'll stick around for questions and conversations. This story is central to what Maggid's all about. We've kind of had a bunch of different pieces here, but I'll try to pull them together at this point. On the one hand, this story is about the supremacy of Beit Hillel over Beit Shammai. And remember, why do we paskin like Beit Hillel? Beit Hillel always deferred and taught the teachings of Beit Shammai first. They showed kavod to Beit Shammai. It's about the supremacy. It's about the overcoming of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who treated everyone much better than Rabbi Gamliel, who kicked everyone out of the Beit Midrash, who treated Rabbi Yoshua poorly. It's about kindness. It's about inviting others into the Beit Midrash. It's about narrative over halacha. It's about telling the story that's accessible to everyone over the legalistic teachings of Rabban Gamliel. And it's about the optimism of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva plays a very important role as the host of this Seder. Right? This is his home. This is his Haggadah. This is his overnight. We get to talk about the Haggadah because it's Rabbi Akiva's interpretation that until we reach daylight, until we're physically and spiritually free, freedom is difficult to come by. It's about gathering students. It's about having Talmidim like Rabbi Akiva's thousands of students and like the students that entered the Beit Midrash on that very day. Pesach is about our collective redemption, but it's also about the redemption in each and every generation, right? In their generations, the redemption was about bringing people into Torah. It was about understanding the political divisions that were taking place during that time. It was about unifying under one particular flag. This night is crucial in every generation because we have to redo that, re-experience that every single year. So yes, the story of the Haggadah is about being Mesaper b'Yitzias Mitzrayim. But if we don't do it right, if we don't do it the way that the 5 rabbis did in Bnei Brak that year, then we're going to be missing the point. So I hope that tonight we've looked into a few different interpretations of how you can bring your Seder, pulling some of these ideas together and struggling with many of the same issues, albeit in a 21st century model, to bring your Seder alive today. Thank you all. At this point, I'm happy to take questions, and I'll let people unmute themselves as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So they didn't do the Saper Yitzias Mitzrayim was not a tradition before that.
That's Elie. Her voice is still.
So it's on. So that's a good point. So it's not that it didn't happen beforehand, but it's rather that I would say.
Yeah. She went out with what's his name.
It's not that it didn't happen beforehand, but that it was concretized at this Seder. Right, that at this point, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, now we can take into account Ben Zoma because before he became Nasi, we couldn't hold like him because Rabban Gamliel rejected him. And also it's interesting to note that Ben Zoma, similar to Ben Azai, are not really considered rabbis. They're called Ben Zoma, Ben Azai. It's said that they died young and that they were never achieved the level of rabbi. And so it's interesting that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah should quote from them, because you could imagine Rabban Gamliel wouldn't be so fast to do so.
Well, Rabbi Elazar, they're probably older than Elazar ben Azariah, right?
They were all older than him, for sure.
Right. But I think it's interesting because if Hillel is the one that you could associate with people who are, modifying and changing or modifying minhag, and Shammai is more Haredi and not, and then Gamliel, getting Yavne and Chachmateh, Gamliel was there. He seems to have missed the boat as to why he was saved and why Yavne needed to be created and how we evolved, just like we missed the boat now, in terms of some of the hard lines that we're drawing.
Yeah, I would say, Rabban Gamliel, even though you're right, he's part of the house of Hillel, he becomes the head of Yavne. He seems to be part of perhaps you'd say the old establishment, but he wasn't ready and he wasn't prepared to deal with kind of innovative ways and interpretation. And he also wasn't ready for letting in the students, letting in the new generation. That's essentially what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah represents. The end of the story is that we obviously defer kavod to him. He becomes the Nasi once again, but kind of on this, 75% model. And he was able to change his ways to an extent. And that's why we mentioned later on. I forgot, but Hillel obviously comes up in the Seder also, right? We reference Hillel later. So there is this constant push for the approach of Hillel, which comes up later again.
But it's interesting because if you look at Akiva, it's looking forward, and Gamliel, it's not just looking at freedom. Hillel's, Akiva's freedom is all encompassing, and Gamliel is really focusing on getting the Beit HaMikdash back, and that's why Pesach Matzah Maror and learning Hilchos Pesach, as opposed to getting, moving forward and getting our country back.
Yes, I would agree with that. Rabban Gamliel is a perfect statesman. He's willing to work with the Romans, and Rabbi Akiva obviously does not. That being said, I should note that Rabbi Akiva does meet with Romans. There are stories of Rabbi Akiva going to Rome with Rabban Gamliel, and actually Professor Margolios, who I quoted, believes in one interpretation that he provides that one of the reasons they ended up having their Seder in Bnei Brak was because they had just come back from a trip from Rome, and they arrived on Erev Pesach. We know that there's a story of these rabbis going on sukkahs on a boat to Rome, because there's a machlokas whether how to build a sukkah on a boat. So he says they went on sukkahs and they came back by Pesach. And so they got back, and so Lod is pretty close to the shore. So they went to Lod essentially to have, they went to, Lod is also, but they went to Bnei Brak to have their Seder. They're all on the coast, but that was his interpretation of what exactly happened there. But Rabbi Akiva obviously is going to reject kind of working with the Romans at a certain point.
You had a little bit of a contradiction there. You had at one point you were saying that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was the establishment and he wanted to go only till midnight. And later on you were saying, oh no, he actually wanted to paskin like Rab Zoma and go till the morning. Actually, I think you can meld those two together. I think you can say that he was the new leader, Rab Gamliel was the establishment, and he held the Seder at Rabbi Akiva's place because he wanted to paskin like Rab Zoma, and because Rabbi Akiva was the optimist, and optimism after the destruction of the temple was daylight, the start of something new. Staying at midnight was still morning of the temple because it's the darkest hour. So I think there you get a much more consistent interpretation.
Yeah, no, and I would add that with the Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, so his statement when he's quoting Ben Zoma, so it doesn't necessitate that, it's not necessary that his interpretation of Ben Zoma is that it has to be all night long, right? So it could have been for Rabbi Ben Zoma that it was only until midnight, but nevertheless,
it says Yimei Chayecha Yamim, Kol Yimei Chayecha Halelot, not Chatzi Halela, Halelot.
Yeah,
and also that could be why he chose to have it at Rabbi Akiva's place. Yeah, because he knew he would be able to then be consistent with Rab Zoma and break with Rab, whatever his name was, the old guy.
Ben Gamliel. Yeah, exactly. And that's why the interpretation of Ben Zoma talking even about the Seder night itself, I mentioned that Talmidei Haritzpah think it was that. It's interesting because the Bavli itself, when quoting this Mishnah, does not think it's talking about Seder night. The pasuk he quotes is about the Seder, but the interpretation in the Gemara is that we're actually talking about Kriyat Shema, or that we're talking perhaps about Mariv, whether we should mention Yetziat Mitzrayim in the Tefillot of Mariv. So it's interesting how they took the same phrase of Ben Zoma, but in the Haggadah, it seems to be going in the direction that you're mentioning, that it seems to be talking about the Pesach, right? That seems to be what we're talking about. And that's, I think, what the Talmidei Haritzpah say, and that's what I mentioned. But it is interesting to note that the Gemara takes it in a different way, maybe even further away from the pasuk, which literally opens up on Passover, don't eat chametz, eat matzah for 7 days, and zechor tzeitzcha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha. So it's interesting how Chazal interpret that pasuk. Good point.
That would make sense because the Gemara was kind of written down or constituted around that time, maybe a little earlier, but so they were defending the status quo.
So yeah, the Mishnah that we're quoting here that becomes concretized, it's a little later, but the Gemara discussion happens a few centuries later. But yeah, there's definitely different modes of interpretation that seem to be layered on over the generations.
But I never thought of this Seder that's described with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is kind of the model that we follow today.
Yeah.
It was sort of our model that was established at that time.
For sure.
I was thinking about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I was thinking about that very thing. Yes and no, I think, because I'm thinking about a lot of Sedarim or a lot of time during the Seder is spent talking about halacha, like kazayit and what's it called? Rof kos and all those kinds of things. So I'm just wondering if that's in deference in some way to Rabban Gamliel or.
So that I could comment on the modern state of the Seder by using some words that Ira was just using, which is that maybe we've gone a little too far in the Rabban Gamliel camp most recently. There's much to be said about the hyper-focused nature of the ounces and the cubic, all that stuff, and the history of that over the last 2 or 3 centuries. It's quite fascinating. But I think maybe some of our starim are a little too focused on harming our stomachs with like 400 boxes of matzah. But nevertheless, I think the text is trying to maybe get us in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's actually that's very comforting. Rabbi Levine spoke about today about why we tend not to use maror, horseradish, for maror, because it's a huge amount if we go by those measures.
Yeah.
And he said it would be a lot to eat, so that's why chazeres is much more conducive.
Yeah. Yes.
He just happened to mention that today.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Thank you.
This is wonderful. Thank you.
It's terrific. Thank you.
Nice job.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Nice job.
New meaning to the Seder.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was very interesting.
Kasher Sameach.
Good night, and thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
evening, Rabbi.
Thank you.